Welcome back, mes amis, to part 2 of our investigation into the ABC murders by Agatha Christie. Our panel has reconvened to discuss the next set of chapters, beginning with chapter 13, which involves a conference of the characters to discuss the crime at hand. Do you have any ideas as to who you think might have done it? Well, let's see if our panelists have. So, at this stage, do any of you have any preliminary ideas as to who you think did it?
I think I know who did it, but I'm not 100% sure, so I'm looking forward to reading the next section and getting some more clues.
No idea yet. It's still a little early for me.
I'm only going by intuition, and I know that by the time I finish the next chapter, I'm going to have a different answer, but I did write Deverell ? On my little note. There's something about Deverell, mostly because if you take out some letters, his name is Devil, and that's a little, it's a little cute, but who knows?
So let us begin with our discussion of chapters 13 through 20. Let's start with a discussion of motives. Has any motive come to the surface that you think might be behind the murders?
So in chapter 16, you get another little glimpse of ABC, Alexander Bonaparte Cust, and it does seem like he's sort of shy about women, and he seems to feel like there's a problem with him being noticed by women. And I think in the book they sort of refer to this as sex complex. So that seems to be something that there's some evidence of.
I think Poirot is very much interested in finding out the motive rather than who the person is. I think his point is if he can figure out the mind of the murderer, why the murderer is targeting and doing these murders specifically, he'll have a better understanding of why it's happening. And as he said, as each murder happens, he finds out a little bit more into the mind of who's doing this.
Poirot also mentioned in his hypothesis that individuals are someone who are maybe overlooked and maybe want some attention and to be noted and lauded for what they are doing. Possibly that they are, people who fade into the background, the nondescript kind of characters who don't stand out.
And if Mr. Alexander Bonaparte Cust is the murderer, as the kind of saw in chapter 16, he's just sitting at just got out of a movie and is sitting and listening to people talk about the news headlines that there's a murderer out there. And he's pretty much ignored, and at the end of the chapter, he goes into a cafe for tea and cream, and nobody looks at him or pays him much mind. So that might feed into that.
Mm-hmm. There's one more that I want to mention that they talked about in chapter 13, which is like the murderer might have a possible hatred for Poirot. Like it's a very directed sort of game of cat and mouse that's directed at Poirot.
So we've had murders A and B, and per the title, we now come to murder C. It begins, of course, with a letter.
So the third letter arrived at 10 p.m. in the evening on the 30th of the month, and saying that it was going to be happening in Churston on the 30th. So the letter literally arrived at the 11th hour on the day that this is going to be happening. But there was an issue with the address, and it was re-sent twice, and it was sent first to the White Horse Apartments, and then it went on and on and on until it finally found them.
So one possible theory for the sort of misdirection that the letter took was a possible mix-up of like the White Horse whiskey brand that maybe the murderer was looking at, and they wrote White Horse instead of Poirot's actual address. My feeling is this person is very, very meticulous and is very detail-oriented, and I think he did it on purpose. What do you all think?
I think it was an incredible coincidence that Crone was the one who suggested that maybe that's why it was mislabeled, because he was drinking whiskey. Gee. I don't know. I've been suspicious of him for a bit now because police officer, he's a detective, he's involved in the case. Serial killers like to get involved in the cases that they're involved in. They like to see the behind the scenes.
He has a lot to say on the topic.
He has a lot
for
to
sure.
say.
And
Like-
he feels like he's an expert. One could consider him an expert since he's done it, but he seems like a little too
He wants attention.
much. Yeah.
Which seems perfectly fitting with Poirot's explanation of who this type of killer might be, and he also tends to speak over people and reuse some of Poirot's comments and take them as his own, so he looks better in front of people. I don't know.
So why don't we get into the murder scene and what actually happened for this particular crime?
Okay, so Murder C was Sir Carmichael Clark, an elderly gentleman who used to be a well-known throat specialist. Now he's retired and he's pursuing his true passion, which is collecting Chinese pottery and porcelain. He's married. His wife, Lady Clark, is very ill. She has incurable cancer. And according to his only brother, Franklin Clark, this caused Sir Clark a lot of emotional distress. But other than that, he was not suffering from any other anxieties or depression that would lead anyone to believe that he would take his own life or that somebody would be after him or he had any enemies. His pattern was he took a stroll after dinner every evening, and it was the same route, and they found his body on that route with his head bashed in from behind with the copy of the ABC directory laying on him, like the previous two murders.
Carmichael Clark lives on an estate in Churston called Comeside, lots of C's.
So many C's.
Chinese pottery, again, hit in the back of the head, which is the same as Mrs. Asher at the first case. When they took to walk to the crime, Crome kind of gave an idea of what he thought happened, which I thought was interesting. Carmichael's brother, Franklin, was very offended by Crome ad-libbing on what he thinks might have happened, and that caused some friction.
Well, and he completely jumped over what Inspector Crome was saying and said, Poirot, what do you think? Which I think ruffled,
Yes.
Chrome's feathers. The other character that was introduced is Miss Thora Gray, who was Sir Clark's secretary, and she was noted to have Scandinavian features with, very colorless ash hair, light gray eyes, very pale, about 27 years old, but from all accounts she seemed very capable of her job, but she was gave an account of, Sir Clark's daily routine, and nothing was out of the ordinary from her point of view.
Were there any other suspects or witnesses that suggested anything that might have happened or anyone that they might have seen?
Well, no one at that day said they saw anything. Later on in the story, they went back and talked to Lady Clark, and she said that she did see one of the characters meeting with someone, and that was Thora Gray. She was having a conversation with a man outside, and Lady Gray had a lot of questions about Thora and thought she was a liar and did not trust her.
Lady Clark.
Lady Clark did
Yeah.
not trust Thora.
Yeah. So that's certainly suspicious.
Yes,
Especially because Thora didn't mention meeting with anyone.
right.
Kind of going off the last chapter, chapter 20, Lady Clark, and her dislike of Thora Gray, something that I kind of noted was that, she talked about both of her husband and her brother-in-law were both chivalrous men. Thora Gray also made a point when she came back to Poirot's rooms and said she had been terminated from her job and she didn't want to hide behind Mr. Clark's chivalry. I think, for my interpretation of Lady Gray's dislike of Thora was that she's the type of woman who immediately is seen as someone who needs to be rescued, and maybe not so much in reality. She plays a part that is false.
I do want to sort of mention Deverell. He's Sir Carmichael Clark's, I think, footman or servant of some kind. He does seem to be lurking about a lot. I'm not terribly suspicious of him, but you can't, when you're reading a murder mystery novel, you can't discount wordplay. So, I am a little bit suspicious only because, again, he's got sort of devil in his name, but he could be overlooked. He does try to be pretty, I think, exacting in his work, so I think he would have high attention to detail, and he could be at the stage where he would like some more attention. He's been doing his job so well for so long, perhaps maybe he, was looking for some good job or something like that, and he took it too far.
We have a serial killer that has killed 3 victims so far. Have you noted any connections between the victims yet? Have any connections been made?
The murder about the C's kind of throws a wrench into the works because we were dealing with 2 women in A and B. They were both seen to be, pretty when they were younger. One was still younger. And then now we have an older gentleman who they don't mention his prettiness at all. So C is a little bit different. And I would say there's even more C stuff than there were B stuff and A stuff. That was kind of surprising to me. Almost like maybe that was like the inevitable one that we were getting to. And maybe B and A were sort of supposed to hide that C or somehow, mask it. But I don't know.
I disagree. As far as C is the important one. I think B is the important one. Because that's the only one where she wasn't struck on the back of the head. She was strangled to death, which is, in my opinion, a very passionate type of murder. You're up close and personal, whether you're behind them or in front, you can feel them struggling. Whereas the other ones, you're just giving them a whack, and that's the end of it, and they die. But you're not hands-on. In the same way, and they're being struck from behind, so they're not even looking at the killer when it happens, and vice versa. The killer doesn't feel strongly about these people, or at least maybe doesn't feel like they don't want to look at the person when they're killing them. So I don't feel like there's a connection there, or at least maybe there's some guilt there that they're actually killing these people. So I think A and C are just plot points, let's say, to make it appear that this is a serial killing, whereas I don't think it really is.
That's a really, really good point, Nan. That the way that Betty was killed was much more visceral, let's say.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think earlier I think it was chapter 13 when we started this section, Poirot was talking about, trying to figure out the motive. He was asking, what's the importance of this alphabetical complex? And he made a note that I thought was kind of important, so that, if they're alphabetically selected, then they're not being removed because they're a source of annoyance to him personally. Something about the alphabet that's important. Then Poirot said towards the end of our section that we read, chapter 20, he was talking about, he's very interested in the human developments that arise from these 3 tragic events. And you have 3 separate families with 3 separate dramas that never would have been linked together. They would never would have touched each other. But now because we're talking about 3 different murders and the different people involved and what's happening in everyone's lives, I think we're going to see some more threads emerge that I can't see right now.
As part of his investigations, Poirot has taken it upon himself to gather the key witnesses and potential suspects together as part of a conversation, a sort of informal group to try to solve these ABC murders. So, we ask our panelists, what do they think about these sessions with the characters involved?
So if we talk about the decision by Poirot to bring sort of the interested and living parties together who are involved in each of the 3 murders as they stand now, it seems to me like the point of this is to kind of get them all talking to each other, kind of split them off into discussion groups just to see if there's something they can figure out together, or if they're coming up with similar threads, kind of like what we're trying to do. And so I think it's less about what they're tasked to do by Poirot, and it's more about giving certain people across the different families FaceTime to sort of talk about what happened.
I think he assumes that they know something that they don't realize that they know, and it's probably something that's very innocuous. It's not going to be this big, huge thing they're going to easily remember. It's probably a very minute, very simple thing. But I think the goal of bringing the people who are involved in each of the murders, the family members together, they can talk, and hopefully whatever that little thing is that someone knows that they don't know that they know, it's going to fall into this puzzle of trying to figure out the mind of this murderer. And also I think that the families themselves came to that conclusion. Mary and Franklin both reached out to Poirot and said, hey, I think we need to meet together, the family members.
This might also give Agatha Christie a chance to do the big sit-down reveal, which I think is a trope of some of her novels, where Poirot is like, it's one of you in this room. I assume that's coming eventually, but if that's the case, then it's one of them in the room, and I personally don't believe that he has invited my prime suspect to these talks, so I'm a little bit confused by how the reveal is going to roll out.
It's Franklin Clark, Megan Barnard, Donald Fraser, Mary Drower, and Thora Gray. They're all brought together so they can talk and try and figure out if anyone saw anything that could bring some light to the crime and help narrow down the field of suspects, which is pretty much everyone at this point, hypothetically. He kind of goes down the line and talks to each of them and asks them, first he talked to Clark and he asked him, what did you do that day? Who did you see? Things like that, and asked some follow-up questions which kind of revealed some more details about the people that he encountered on his walk that day. And he went down the line and did this to everyone, but there was a couple people he didn't ask follow-up questions to, which I thought was interesting. He did not ask follow-up questions to Thora Gray, who just said she wrote some correspondence in the morning, did needlework, and then went to bed early. No one stepped forward and said, yes, I saw her go into her room or whatever like that, and she was in bed, as opposed to some of the others who he followed up and asked more questions about and wanted to get some more details. He didn't bother with her, which I thought was interesting. And the other thing I thought was interesting was that she was interrupting Poirot as he was asking certain people questions and trying to divert the conversation away from them. Mostly Donald Fraser. He was a little bit uncomfortable and she would interrupt. Not much comes out in the conversation between them. No more real details are revealed about the criminal or if they saw the person. None of that. And then they decide to work out how they're going to question different people that were connected to the crimes. Billy Higley, who was working with Betty, and he assigned it to either Megan or Don, came out that Thora had moved to London afterwards, which she thought was interesting, that she'd relocated. And Mary was also asked to go speak to the kids and hand over to see if they had seen anything, because they play on the street and linger in the area around the shop. So they're trying to find little clues, but it's also more like he's just giving them something to do so that they're occupied and feel like they're contributing something. After the conference, they go home and the police start doing some investigation, and some of the evidence is released to kind of give people a warning as to what's going on, because previously the police hadn't released everything. They were trying to keep it under wraps. Hastings is annoyed because he thinks Poirot should be out there doing some investigating of his own, and Poirot is reflecting on what he's learned so far and trying to figure out a motive and figure out maybe who done it. And one of the things he said that I thought was interesting, there are indications as though there are two intelligences at work, which kind of fits what I was thinking, because there are certain times where it seems like perhaps maybe one person is giving themselves an alibi while there's someone else who's doing it, because there's a lot of traveling happening here. So if the person is involved, they would need someone else to do some things.
Well, we've had an A, B, and C murders. What about D?
Crome was sure they would get him by F, I think.
Yeah.
So I think we should anticipate another one. So as Jenny mentioned, Poirot indicated that the more murders there are, the more details and information he's getting. So, it's a little bit of a cold take, but I assume the more information he has, the easier it will be to solve the case.
Poirot's pretty pragmatic, I think, and he's kind of accepted that he's not always going to be in time to stop these. Even if they know where it is, they still have to figure out who in this community is the likely target, and there might be more than one. So he's kind of accepted that he's not going to be able to stop him as he's getting ready to commit the crime. So I think he's more concerned about, the end game and identifying the culprit than saving people.
So what are some of the takeaways that you would like to have recorded for clues?
One thing we haven't discussed yet is in chapter 16, which is sort of from Alexander Bonaparte Cust's point of view. There is this question about whether he was in the war and whether that sort of triggered maybe like a PTSD moment. And he did mention that he has headaches as a result of a war injury or something like that.
Let's do the White Horse Whiskey. As I said before, find it very interesting that Crome gave that as an explanation for why this envelope could possibly have been misaddressed, and having that bottle on his table while he's writing the address out, and ooh, wouldn't be a coincidence. Poirot seemed to accept that and complimented Crome on his cleverness, which is not something that Poirot generally does, which I thought was like a pat on the back, stroke to the ego kind of a situation. Other things where he copied what Poirot had said in earlier chapters, like during the conference chapter, Poirot was talking about why ABC might have done this, and that maybe they're not perceived as being someone important and they want to puff themselves up and things like that. And Crome reiterated that to Franklin Clark to try make himself look good, speaking over Poirot. Was upset when Carmichael wanted Poirot's opinion as the expert as opposed to Crome's. I don't know, I just feel like he is easily offended when someone else gets attention over him.
So I think one of my clues definitely is I think the war has something to do with, I don't know if it's a motive or if it's a reasoning, because the thing I picked up of chapter 16 from Mr. Alexander Bonaparte Cust is he laughed for some time at the statement of the person sitting next to him that, oh, well, war's preventable. So that seems to be something that might be having to do with, or might be important enough.
I'm going to bring it back to Nan's comment, which is B is sort of a passion to kill and A and C are not. So there might be something special about Betty's murder.
Well, if we go with the coincidence that Betty likes the men and will date guys to go out in town or get presents or things like that, I'm wondering if this is related to that. Because otherwise she lived a pretty quiet life, engaged, worked as a waitress. But that seems like maybe something that would be triggered, especially in the, as we're saying, that ABC is kind of unnoticed by the ladies when he's going on his walk. Whereas others are getting second looks. So he's not particularly attractive. So maybe he was offended if Betty either overlooked him or tossed him aside once he outlooked his usefulnus.
Also, I think I want to mention something on the board about Megan.
She seems a little too smart for her own good.
Well, she's very intelligent.
Yeah.
I don't get an inkling that she is involved. Poirot has mentioned her multiple times and her intelligence. And like she said that when they met together, she's just like, words, you're just talking words, they don't really mean anything. What's the significance behind it? I think she might be have something, a clue that she doesn't know about or something. That's kind of like my gut feeling. And Donald Fraser had the dream that he strangled Megan, not Betty. So I'm like, Megan is important in some way, I feel.
I think there's at least two killers.
And if you go by A, B, C, that's 3.
But I think the coincidence that 2 of them were struck from behind is pretty something. If they'd been each killed in a completely different way and the ABC was the only connecting, the book place there was the only connecting thing, I would be 100% on this, that there's a killer per crime. But because there's only 2 methods of death right now, I don't think that's true. I'm going with Crome as one of the killers. He's got strong motive against Poirot. He's bothered when he gets attention over him. And then other things which happened with some of the comments that he makes, but we're going to get it by the time they get to F. Is there any more? Did they not plan murders after F? Oh, he comments on the brother going for a walk every evening, but that wasn't mentioned before. There was no mention that someone came forward and told them that. He just kind of says that. So I'm wondering if this is something that he knew because he was involved.
Crome also had a lot to say about what the murderer would think about the letters being publicized.
Yes.
As well. He had a lot of strong assertions about about that as well.
Yes. And tried to redirect the conversation a couple times when those kind of remarks were being made and interject. Franklin Clark said that he tries to look as though he knows everything, but he doesn't know anything as far as Franklin can tell. He's just making comments and assertions and things like that and acting like he has an actual clue of what's happening here. I think he does have a clue what's happening here, but it doesn't actually make sense because he's not backing it up with any actual evidence. He's just throwing out details of the crimes or things that Poirot has said to make himself look better when he doesn't actually have any intelligence or wherewithal to back that up.
Because if he gave details and things that he knows that no one else has known yet, it might reveal that he's in on it somehow.
Right, and his whole comment about how the guy must have been hiding in these bushes, and then when Carmichael went by, he jumped out and hit him in the back of the head. Like, okay, how do we know that?
So, along those lines, in terms of you've kind of given an idea of what you think for killer, motive?
I think I also kind of leaning toward Crone. He is an investigator in a murder investigation, so he's gonna comment on his thoughts. But there's something else there that's I don't know. So in that case, and based on some of the things Nan just shared, I think sort of a superiority and a hatred of Poirot, I think, are kind of where I'm leaning.
The other person I'm looking at, which I've already said is Thora Gray. Crone was in London at the time of that murder because he actually answered the phone at Scotland Yard and then went with them on the train. I don't think he could have gone back and forth, but Thora, who conveniently doesn't have a very good alibi, was there and had hidden the fact that there was a man that stopped by earlier in the day, which could have been Crone because there was enough time for him to get back and forth at that point.
Well, maybe. Lady Clark said it was a shabby sort of person, and I can't, unless Crone was in disguise.
You can wear different clothes. They didn't give a very glowing description of him. He's not portrayed as a handsome man or someone with unique looks or anything like that. So I feel like it could be him if he dressed in a certain way. And also, we don't know what Lady Clark's consideration of shabby is.
My goodness. Are our librarians on the right track with their speculation? Probably not. But it is interesting to see what directions that they are going in terms of solving this crime. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments, as you've been following along, of who you think did it. As a side note, some Christie trivia to share with you all. This particular book, The ABC Murders, was dedicated to James Watts, who was Agatha Christie's brother-in-law. In it, she says, "To James Watts, one of my most sympathetic readers," which wonders if that might have been a little bit of sarcasm there, for Watts was known as saying Christie's murders were relatively bloodless, which in turn led to Hercule Poirot's Christmas, also known as A Holiday for Murder, which is anything but bloodless. Until next time,